The sun was beating down on Buckingham Palace when Jackson Smith, drunk after a few beers, approached the guardsman. The tourists were supposed to be passing by, but Jackson decided that this moment would be the perfect opportunity to taunt the guard. "What, is this something for a photo? You're just a doll in a suit." He laughed out loud. His friends laughed along, filming everything with their cameras. He approached the guardsman, hoping to surprise him and laugh at the medals hanging on his chest. "These medals must be souvenirs from gift shops, right?" Jackson said, waving his hand. But Sergeant Adam Crawford, standing, did not move. His eyes remained fixed in one spot, but there was something else about his calm. When Jackson reached out to touch the medal, the guardsman instantly intercepted his hand. It was a move so quick and precise that Jackson didn't even realize what was happening. The crowd froze. Jackson tried to break free, but the guard held him with a hand that was firm but without excessive aggression. Adam gave him a cold look and said quietly, "Don't touch the medals." The London sun was scorching the asphalt, and even in the July heat, Buckingham Palace remained a place where more tourists came every hour. Everyone wanted to see not only the famous facades and the Royal Guard, but also to feel the atmosphere of traditions that have accompanied this part of British history for hundreds of years. Meanwhile, this very place became an arena for a new scene, completely different from what those who came for ordinary photos expected. Sergeant Adam Crawford, silent and unruffled, had been standing at his post for over an hour. His red uniform and black hat were perfectly tailored. The medals on his chest reflected the sunlight, but they were not just part of his uniform. They were the result of decades of hard service. They were a symbol of what he had been through, the trials, the danger, the sacrifices he had made for his country. And although his gaze never left one fixed point, his eyes had a story that few people could understand. Everyone around him was moving, fussing, trying to take a photo, but for Adam, it was just another shift. Nothing mattered, only the post and the fulfillment of his duty. But today, this day, something was going to change. Jackson Smith, a young man with a drunken look and a carefree smile, approached the crowd outside the palace. He was holding a plastic bottle of beer in his hands, and his face betrayed a slight misunderstanding of what was happening around him. He was the kind of person who doesn't think about consequences, who is amused by the thought of destroying the peace and decency of others. "Listen, look at this guy." His voice cut through the air. "Are you standing here like a statue again? Maybe another souvenir to sell?" Jackson exclaimed as his gaze fell on Adam, who did not move or even look at him. For Jackson, it was just another joke, a chance to show his friends that he could break any rule and get away with it. His friends were laughing, filming it on their phones. The crowd around him just shrugged their shoulders, realizing that he was one of those types who shouldn't be ignored, but at the same time, shouldn't be taken seriously. "Maybe your medals are worth less than this bottle," Jackson continued, moving even closer to Adam, studying his form. "What the hell is this? Straight out of a tourist shop?" He laughed, making fun of the medals hanging on the guardsman's chest. He continued his show, confident that everyone would now laugh with him. However, his joke quickly lost all meaning. Adam, who remained unmoved, felt that the situation was getting out of hand. The crowd around him grew quiet as he watched Jackson get closer and closer to him, leaning toward the medals. It was a moment that could have led to something much more serious. Without hesitation, Jackson reached out to the medals, trying to shout something. His fingers were ready to touch the medal to do what he longed to do, to show that the guardsman was just part of the theater for tourists. But it was at that moment that Adam made a move that became Jackson's last chance to return to reality. His hand instantly grabbed Jackson's wrist, stopping him in his tracks. The whole atmosphere changed in an instant. The tourists, who just a second ago were looking at this as an interesting scene, became quiet. Jackson, who felt pinned down, could not understand what had happened. His friends began to stop, watching as it all got out of hand. And then, at one point, Jackson realized that he was no longer in control. Adam took his time, looked at him with a cold gaze, and after only a few seconds, said one simple word, "Don't touch it." Jackson did not immediately realize what had happened. His hand, which had just been ready to touch the medals, now found itself in a firm grip that seemed to tie him to the spot. He tried to pull his hand away, but his efforts were in vain. Adam held him with such ease that Jackson felt as if his own strength had vanished in an instant. "What are you doing?" Jackson mumbled, trying to sound brave. However, his voice was not so confident anymore. He felt fear gradually filling his mind. However, his pride did not allow him to admit it. His friends stood by, looking at each other anxiously, but no one dared to intervene. Adam did not budge. His expression remained unchanged, cold, emotionless. He just stood there, maintaining an unquestioning silence that now seemed even more oppressive. The few seconds that had passed seemed like an eternity to Jackson. "I was just kidding." Jackson tried to justify himself as his pride began to crack. He realized that he had changed his tone, but he didn't know how to get out of this situation. But the guard did not react to his words. He just stood there, holding his wrist in his fingers, which had never betrayed him on the battlefield. His every movement was calculated, his every gesture precise, as if expressing a command that would not accept objections. And at that moment, Jackson felt that he was facing not just a military man, but a man who was used to keeping the situation under control even in the most difficult conditions. Everyone around froze, watching this moment. The tourists were no longer laughing as before. One man behind Jackson turned around and quietly said to his wife, "This man is not just in the photo, he is really here to guard. It's not just a costume." Everyone nodded silently to each other, feeling the pressure of what was happening. Jackson tried to change his strategy. He was confused and unsure, trying to pull his arm out, but the guard wasn't about to let go. "What, you want another joke?" he asked again, although he was no longer sure of his words. Adam didn't answer, just glanced at the medals that Jackson was so unceremoniously trying to evaluate. They were not just metal signs. They did not just hang on his chest, they carried a heavy history that Jackson could not even imagine. But for Jackson, this was a different reality. He was no longer in the role of a man who could joke and control the situation. His humor was noticeably fading, and the details of the guardsman were becoming more and more clear before his eyes. Every seam of his uniform, every finger on his hand that held his wrist. Jackson didn't even understand what exactly had happened, but he began to feel something he had never experienced before, fear. And when he made another attempt to pull his hand out, the guard looked at him, and his gaze became so hard and unwavering that Jackson was forced to stop. It was the look of a man who had survived more than one battle and knew how to behave in critical situations. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," Adam said, and although his voice was quiet, it sounded as if every word was carved in stone. Jackson fell silent, feeling everything in him begin to crumble. The silence around him became deafening. Jackson couldn't understand what had happened, but every part of his body felt like it was losing control. And although he tried to keep a straight face, he could feel his confidence tearing apart inside. He was a common bully who scared the weak and laughed at those who could not fight back. But now he was facing a man who was not only ready for a fight, he was living it. Jackson felt his arm become powerless in Adam's grip. He tried again to pull his arm out, but to no avail. At first it seemed like a joke to him, a strong one, but not serious. However, now that he could not free himself, it became clear he was not able to defeat this man. His fingers began to tremble with desperation, and it no longer felt like a game. Jackson's friends stood by, silently watching, but they too could sense that the situation was heading in a dangerous direction. One of them, a guy with a tattoo on his neck, whispered quietly, "Maybe we should leave. This is no joke." But Jackson didn't want to back down. As always, he wanted to be a leader, even when he realized he had already made a huge mistake. "You can't hold me like this," he shouted, although his voice didn't sound so stubborn. But Adam didn't answer, just continued to hold his hand, silently assessing the situation. Everything about him spoke of experience. He knew when to act and how. Jackson tried to pull his hand away again, and even then he did not feel the slightest movement from Adam. The guard was stony, unyielding. But now it became clear that this was not just a conflict in the square in front of the palace. It was a clash of two different worlds. One is a cruel one, with wounded pride, where one does not consider others, where everyone has the right to their own opinion, even if it is based on ignorance and misunderstanding. The second is a world of discipline and sacrifice, where every movement is thought out and has its meaning. And this world was completely different. It was different from anything Jackson had ever dealt with before. "What do you want me to do?" Adam asked unemotionally, his voice showing no sign of anger or fear. They were just words spoken on a level of observation. Jackson did not answer, although he felt that he could not answer. All his phrases seemed empty. He tried to restore his pride, but it was melting in the air like snow in the sun. He realized that even if he shouted or twitched, it would not change the situation. Adam loosened his grip a little, and Jackson immediately felt his arm return to freedom, but now he didn't care. All his stubbornness, which he had cultivated for so long, instantly lost its meaning. He began to realize that he had not only offended the man, but also underestimated the consequences of his behavior. He found himself in a situation where he simply did not have the strength or ability to take things back. The crowd around him was whispering quietly to each other, sharing glances. Some even took a step back, silently watching what had happened. Everyone realized that this was more than just an ordinary incident with a tourist and a guardsman. It was a clash of two worlds that could not coexist peacefully. Jackson looked back at his friends and saw their faces reflecting a bit of fear and doubt. One of them said quietly, "Maybe we should leave. This is not a win-win situation." Jackson just nodded his head, but the realization that he was no longer in control stayed with him for a long time. Adam, meanwhile, did not budge. He could feel the crowd gradually relaxing, but he wasn't about to leave. He didn't need any more words. He just waited. Jackson stood there, feeling everything inside him shrink. That moment when his pride and self-confidence burst was incredibly hard. He was ready for a lot of things, but not for being put in a situation where his every word was hollow and his every move was unnecessary. His heart was still beating faster, but this time he didn't feel the energy he usually had in such situations. He felt only emptiness. "I was wrong," he finally said, blaming himself. His voice sounded shy at first, then increasingly lost its former self-confidence. "I didn't realize it was so important." Adam did not answer. He stood as before, his hands now free of Jackson's, but his expression remained the same, calm and focused. No anger, no compassion. Only an understanding that this moment had to end this way, and that now Jackson could only understand why it is so important to honor those who wear the uniform, who serve. Everyone around them watched them in silence. The tourists began to slowly disperse, but there was something new in their eyes. They saw not just a guardsman standing at his post. They saw a man who held his power without moving in the most intense moment. Jackson lowered his eyes and slumped his shoulders, as if feeling all his self-confidence slipping away. His friends were no longer laughing or teasing. They were silent as well, but now they realized something they hadn't realized until that moment. "Can we go?" Jackson asked again, now with a sad look that no longer had the challenge it had at the beginning. His voice was quiet, almost shy. Adam nodded. He said nothing more, just returned to his post as he was supposed to. The tourists started taking photos again, but not with the same look they had before. Most of them were now looking at the medals on his chest with respect, realizing that there was much more to these medal insignia than just a part of the costume. The tourists who stayed nearby began to whisper to each other. "This is not just a show," one man said, turning his head to his friend. "These medals, they mean something." "He's a real soldier," added another, watching Jackson walk away with his friends, leaving his old beliefs behind. But the point was not in the words. It was in the change that happened to Jackson. His eyes were no longer full of contempt or mockery. They became quiet, understanding. He realized that what he had tried to devalue was actually a symbol of courage, dedication, and sacrifice that he himself had never experienced. The tourists gradually began to leave, and Adam remained at his post. It was more than just a change in the queue. It was a confirmation that there are moments when even the greatest challenges cannot be met with laughter. And even when it seems like you are alone, you are actually part of something much bigger. As Jackson was leaving, he looked back again. There was no longer any arrogance in his eyes, only the same understanding that had begun to penetrate his mind. And perhaps this understanding was the most valuable part of the lesson he had just learned.